A widow opens her door on a stormy night and finds two identical black twins shivering on her porch. They call her Grandma, but she's never seen them before. As she lets them in, their heartbreaking story unravels, revealing a secret her late husband kept hidden for decades. Who are these girls? What shocking truth did her husband take to the grave? And how will this twist of fate change her life forever? Don't miss this unforgettable tale of family, betrayal, and redemption. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Ruth Callahan's fingers traced the edges of an old photograph, her weathered hands gentle against the plastic sleeve protecting the image. In it, Howard smiled back at her, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners just the way she remembered. The living room, warm and familiar with its floral wallpaper and well-worn furniture, felt especially empty tonight. The shadows from the table lamp cast a soft glow across the decades-old photographs spread before her. "Oh, Howard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whistling wind outside. "The house feels so big without you. Too big for just one person." The snowstorm rattled the windows, making the old Victorian home creak and groan like a living thing. Ruth pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and reached for her tea, the ceramic mug still warm against her palms. Steam curled up from the chamomile blend she always drank before bed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time in a house that had grown too quiet over the past 2 years since Howard's passing. She turned another page in the album, smiling at a picture of their last Christmas together. Howard had insisted on wearing that ridiculous Santa hat, even though it was just the two of them. He'd always known how to make her laugh, even in their quietest moments. The memory brought both warmth and sadness to her heart, making her chest tight with longing. A sharp knock at the door made Ruth jump, spilling a few drops of tea onto her lap. She quickly dabbed at the spots with her sleeve, her heart racing beneath her ribcage. The knock came again, more urgent this time, the sound echoing through the empty house. "Who in the world?" she muttered, setting down her tea and album with trembling hands. Nobody in their right mind would be out in weather like this. The local news had warned everyone to stay inside, predicting one of the worst storms of the season. Ruth approached the door cautiously, her slippered feet silent on the hardwood floor. Through the frosted glass panels, she could make out two small figures on her porch, their shapes blurred by the ice crystals forming on the windows. When she opened the door, the bitter wind rushed in, along with swirls of snow that sparkled in the porch light. There on her doorstep stood two identical girls, their dark skin dusted with snowflakes, their shoulders hunched against the cold. They couldn't have been more than 13 years old, and neither wore a proper winter coat. "Can I help you?" Ruth asked, concern creeping into her voice as she took in their inadequate clothing. The girl on the right, wearing a purple knit hat pulled low over her ears, stepped forward. "Are you Ruth Callahan?" "I am. Yes." Ruth's hand tightened on the doorknob, uncertainty making her fingers grip the brass handle harder. "We're Selah and Simone," the same girl continued, her voice trembling slightly but determined. "And you're our grandmother." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded. She stared at the girls, taking in their matching features, their desperate expressions, and the worn backpacks slung over their shoulders. The one who spoke, Simone, she assumed, met her gaze steadily, chin lifted in defiance, while the other girl, Selah, seemed to shrink behind her sister, eyes downcast. "There must be some mistake," Ruth managed to say, but even as the words left her mouth, she noticed something familiar in their faces, something in the shape of their eyes and the curve of their cheeks that reminded her of Howard in his youth. Another gust of wind howled through the porch, making both girls shiver violently, their teeth chattering audibly. Whatever the truth was, Ruth couldn't leave them out in this weather. Her grandmother's heart wouldn't allow it. "Come inside," she said, stepping back. "We can sort this out where it's warm." The girls hurried in, tracking snow onto her welcome mat, their shoes leaving wet prints on the dark wood floor. Ruth quickly closed the door against the storm, her mind whirling with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. She led them to the living room, where the fire still burned steadily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Let me get you some tea and blankets," she said, her instinct to care for others temporarily overriding her confusion and disbelief. "You both look half frozen. Sit close to the fire." The twins sat close together on her floral sofa, their eyes darting around the room like startled deer. Ruth noticed how Simone kept one protective arm around her sister's shoulders, while Selah seemed to lean into the touch, seeking comfort in her twins' presence. Their bond was obvious even to a stranger. As Ruth headed to the kitchen, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. Grandmother? How could that be possible? Howard had never mentioned having grandchildren, or even children for that matter. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the immediate need to warm up these two frightened girls who had appeared on her doorstep like ghosts from a past she didn't know existed. Whatever secrets Howard had kept, these children needed help now, and that's what mattered most. Ruth woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping in her armchair. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the living room floor. The events of last night crashed back into her consciousness. Two young girls, claiming to be Howard's granddaughters, now sleeping in her guest room. She rubbed her eyes, trying to dispel the lingering hope that it had all been a dream. Her joints protested as she made her way to the kitchen, each step a reminder of another sleepless night spent in that old chair. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with its familiar aroma. Outside, the world was blanketed in pristine white snow, peaceful in a way that felt almost mocking given the turmoil in her heart. Cardinals flitted between the bare branches of the maple tree, their red feathers bright against the winter landscape. "Should I wake them?" she murmured to herself, gripping her coffee mug tightly, its warmth doing little to ease the chill in her bones. Before she could decide, soft footsteps on the stairs answered her question, followed by the creak of that loose floorboard on the landing. The twins appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing their clothes from yesterday, wrinkled from sleep. Selah hung back slightly while Simone stepped forward, her chin raised with determination despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Their matching faces bore the same exhaustion Ruth felt in her own bones. "Mrs. Callahan," Simone began, her voice steady, "we need to tell you something." Ruth gestured to the kitchen table, the same one where she and Howard had shared countless meals together. "Sit down. I'll make you some breakfast first." Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out eggs and bread. The familiar routine of cooking helped steady her nerves, the rhythmic whisking of eggs and scraping of toast bringing a moment of normalcy to this surreal morning. Once the plates of scrambled eggs and toast were set out, steam rising in delicate wisps, Selah reached into her backpack and withdrew a worn envelope, its edges softened by time. "This was Mom's. Patricia's," she said softly, sliding it across the table. "Our mom died 3 weeks ago," Simone continued, her voice catching. "Car accident, ice on the roads, just like this morning." Ruth's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. "And Howard? You're saying he was our grandfather," Selah whispered, fingers fidgeting with her napkin. "Mom told us before she died. She said he had a relationship with our grandmother before he married you, back in '72. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm, the walls seeming to close in around her. Ruth pushed back from the table, her legs unsteady beneath her. "No, Howard wouldn't. He couldn't have." "It's true," Simone insisted, pulling out a creased photograph from the envelope. "This is our mom with him when she was little, before he stopped coming around. Before everything changed." Ruth stared at the photo, her world tilting sideways. There was Howard, younger but unmistakable, his smile the same one she'd fallen in love with, holding a small black girl with bright eyes and Patricia's same smile. The date stamp showed it was taken 2 years before their marriage, the edges of the photo yellowed with age. "This can't be real," Ruth said, but the evidence was there in front of her, undeniable and devastating. Her Howard, her steady, dependable Howard, had kept this secret for their entire marriage, had looked her in the eye every day and never said a word about having another daughter, had taken this truth to his grave. "We didn't want to come," Selah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we had nowhere else to go." All our relatives are gone, and foster care." She trailed off, exchanging a worried look with her sister, years of unspoken fears passing between them. Ruth's hands shook as she set down the photograph, unable to look away from Howard's familiar face. Anger and betrayal warred with the compassion she felt looking at these two young girls, alone in the world. They were innocent in all this, yet here they were, bearing the weight of adult decisions made long ago, decisions that were now reaching across decades to upend all their lives. "You can stay tonight," she heard herself say, her voice distant to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking through her. Just tonight, while I figure things out." The twins nodded, relief visible on their faces, their shoulders relaxing slightly. Ruth turned to look out the window, unable to meet their eyes. The pristine snow outside seemed to mock the mess her life had become, decades of certainty crumbling like a house of cards. A cardinal landed on the windowsill, its bright red feathers a stark contrast to the white world beyond, reminding her that even in the depths of winter, life went on. After a silent breakfast, Ruth stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor. "I need to check something," she said, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. The twins watched with curious eyes as she pulled down the attic stairs from the hallway ceiling, the old wood creaking in protest. The musty smell of forgotten memories hit her as she climbed up, each step feeling heavier than the last. Dust motes danced like tiny stars in the weak morning light streaming through the small window, casting long shadows across the cramped space. Ruth hadn't been up here since Howard's passing. It held too many memories, too much of their life together, each box and trunk a testament to their shared history. Her hands shook as she opened the first box marked Howard Personal, the cardboard worn soft at the corners from age. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, old letters bound with faded rubber bands, and photographs curling at the edges. Her heart nearly stopped when she found an envelope tucked at the bottom, its flap loose from time. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, with Howard's distinctive nose and gentle eyes. Features so familiar they made Ruth's chest ache. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as her fingers traced the edge of the image. Digging deeper through the layers of Howard's past, she discovered a faded postcard, its corners dog-eared from handling. The handwriting was unfamiliar but neat, each letter carefully formed. "Dear Dad, thank you for the money this month. It helps more than you know. Love, Patricia." The date showed it was from 25 years ago, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. Ruth's vision blurred with tears as the implications sank in. "Mrs. Callahan?" Selah's soft voice made Ruth jump, her heart racing. Both girls had followed her up, standing uncertainly by the attic entrance, their shadows stretching across the dusty floorboards. "Can we help you look?" Simone stepped forward with quiet determination, her eyes scanning the boxes stacked against the walls. Mom didn't talk about him much, but she always said he tried to help when he could. She understood his situation, even if it wasn't ideal. "She worked 2 jobs most of our life," Selah added quietly, reaching into her pocket with hesitant movements. She pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age and worn smooth from years of handling. This was Mom's most precious possession. She never took it off. Ruth took the locket with trembling fingers, feeling its weight, both physical and emotional. Inside was a tiny, worn photograph of Howard, much younger than she'd ever known him, his dark hair untouched by gray. He was smiling that familiar smile that had always made her feel safe and loved, the one that had won her heart decades ago. The truth was undeniable now, laid bare in the morning light filtering through years of dust. The Howard she knew, her kind, honest Howard, had lived a double life. He'd had another family, a daughter he'd supported in secret, making choices she never knew about. Ruth sank onto an old trunk, clutching the photograph and postcard to her chest, feeling the world she thought she knew shift beneath her feet. Simone moved closer, her footsteps gentle on the creaking floorboards, her voice softer than before. "Mom never blamed him, you know. She said he did what he thought was right at the time. She always spoke of him with respect." Ruth looked at the girls, Howard's granddaughters, and saw shadows of him in their faces, the curve of their smiles, the shape of their eyes. Her anger at his deception warred with the growing realization that these children needed help, needed her. But could she be what they needed? The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like the thick dust in the attic, threatening to overwhelm her as she sat surrounded by the evidence of her husband's hidden past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ruth's kitchen floor as she wiped down the counters for the third time. Her mind wandered while her hands moved mechanically over the already clean surface. Beside her, Selah quietly dried dishes while Simone arranged them in neat stacks. A sharp knock at the door made them all freeze. Ruth's heart jumped into her throat as she set down her cleaning cloth. Through the front window, she glimpsed an official-looking woman in a dark coat. "Hello, I'm Ms. Perry from Child Protective Services," the woman said when Ruth opened the door. Her voice was professional but kind. "May I come in? A neighbor called about 2 young girls staying here." Ruth's stomach tightened as she led Ms. Perry into the living room. The twins hovered uncertainly in the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Callahan, can you explain your relationship to these children?" Ms. Perry asked, pulling out a notepad. Ruth twisted her wedding ring. "It's complicated. They're my late husband's granddaughters. I only just found out about them yesterday." Ms. Perry's eyebrows rose. "And you have documentation of guardianship?" "No, not yet. They arrived during the storm with evidence that my husband—" Ruth's voice cracked. "That he had another daughter." "I see." Ms. Perry's pen scratched across her notepad. "Mrs. Callahan, while I sympathize with your situation, I need to ensure these girls have proper legal guardianship. Without documentation, they may need to enter the foster system until this is sorted out." "No!" Simone burst out, rushing forward. "Please don't separate us. Ruth is our only family." Selah remained in the doorway, but Ruth saw tears sliding down her cheeks. "I understand this is difficult," Ms. Perry said gently, "but we need to follow proper procedures. I'll give you a few days to consider becoming their legal guardian or to make other arrangements. I'll check back on Friday." After Ms. Perry left, the twins stood close together, their faces etched with worry. Ruth felt the weight of their hopes pressing down on her shoulders. "You can stay for now," she said quietly. "We'll figure something out." That evening, Ruth sat in her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the setting sun painted the snow-covered yard in shades of pink and gold. The beauty felt at odds with the turmoil in her heart. Could she really take on 2 teenagers at her age? What would the neighbors think? Yet every time she looked at their faces, she saw traces of Howard, the man she'd loved for 40 years, even if he'd kept secrets from her. Ruth pressed her hand against the cool window glass, watching her breath fog the pain. The decision looming before her seemed impossible, yet somehow she knew it would define not just her future, but the futures of 2 young girls who had already lost so much. The morning sun filtered through Ruth's kitchen window, casting pale squares of light across the breakfast table. She mechanically stirred pancake batter, her mind still replaying Ms. Perry's words from yesterday. Behind her, she heard the twins' soft footsteps on the stairs. "Good morning," Ruth said, trying to sound cheerful. "I thought we could have pancakes today." Selah and Simone slipped into their seats, their usual energy dampened. Ruth noticed how Simone kept her eyes down, while Selah fidgeted with her sleeve. "We need to get some groceries," Ruth announced, setting plates of steaming pancakes in front of them. "I thought you girls could come with me to the store." The drive into town was quiet. Ruth pulled into Parker's Grocery, the same store she'd shopped at for 30 years. As they walked through the automatic doors, the familiar ding of the entry bell seemed louder than usual. Ruth felt the stares immediately. Mrs. Johnson from the library paused mid-reach for a loaf of bread, her eyes widening. Tom, the produce manager who always saved Ruth the freshest tomatoes, nearly dropped a box of apples. "Let's get some fruit first," Ruth said, pushing her cart toward the produce section. She noticed how Selah stayed close to her side while Simone walked slightly ahead, her shoulders tense. "Ruth? Ruth Callahan?" Ruth turned to see Martha Harper approaching, her face arranged in what Ruth recognized as her concerned Christian expression. "Hello, Martha," Ruth replied, unconsciously stepping closer to the twins. I haven't seen you at Wednesday Bible study lately, Martha said, her eyes darting between Sela and Simone. And who are these young ladies? Just visiting, are they? Ruth felt Sela press against her side. Simone's jaw tightened visibly. No, Martha, Ruth said firmly. They're family. Oh? Martha's eyebrows rose. I didn't know you had any family besides Howard's cousin in Michigan. Well, there's a lot we don't know about each other, isn't there? Ruth replied, her voice carrying a new edge. She placed a protective hand on Sela's shoulder. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have shopping to finish. They moved through the remaining aisles quickly, gathering essentials while enduring curious glances and whispered conversations. Ruth noticed how Simone's usual confident stride had become hesitant, how Sela seemed to shrink into herself. The drive home was silent except for the soft hum of the car heater. In the rearview mirror, Ruth watched the twins staring out their respective windows, their faces reflecting the same uncertainty she felt in her heart. Ruth ran the duster along the mantelpiece, her movements methodical and practiced. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room floor, where Sela and Simone had settled near the bay window. The quiet was comfortable, broken only by the occasional turning of pages. Then a soft melody filled the air. Ruth's hand froze mid-dust. The tune was achingly familiar. Moon River, Howard's favorite song. He used to hum it while tending to his beloved rose garden, his deep voice carrying through the open windows on summer evenings. Where did you learn that song? Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Simone looked up from her book. Mom used to hum it all the time when she cooked, she said. Simone paused, glancing uncertainly at Ruth. She said Dad taught it to her. Ruth's chest tightened, but she forced herself to nod. On the floor, Sela was bent over a sketch pad, her pencil moving with confident strokes across the paper. Ruth moved closer, drawn by the familiar way Sela's hand moved across the page. May I see? Ruth asked softly. Sela hesitated before turning the pad around. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The drawing captured the snow-covered yard with striking detail, the way the branches bent under the weight of snow, the subtle shadows cast by the afternoon sun. It was exactly how Howard used to draw. Your mother encouraged your art? Ruth found herself asking. She always made sure we had supplies, Sela said quietly, even when money was tight. She worked 2 jobs sometimes, Simone added, but she still made time to sing to us before bed. She knew all these old songs. Mom was really tired most nights, Sela continued, her pencil moving again across the paper. But she'd sit on the edge of our beds and sing anyway. She said music and art were gifts that should be shared. Ruth sank into her armchair, watching Sela's hand move across the paper with Howard's familiar grace. The anger that had been burning in her chest since the twins' arrival began to soften, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of sadness and growing understanding. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Ruth climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Her slippers made soft shuffling sounds against the wooden steps, each creak echoing her determination to uncover more of Howard's past. The attic felt different in the early light. Dust particles danced in the pale sunbeams that filtered through the small window. Ruth moved with purpose toward the far corner where she'd found yesterday's revelations. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened another cardboard box marked Personal. Inside, beneath old tax returns and insurance papers, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The postmarks dated back decades. The first letter made her sink to her knees. It was from Patricia's mother, Sarah, written in a desperate hand. Howard, she's your daughter. I know you're married now, but she needs her father. Letter after letter told the story. Howard's sporadic responses, carefully worded promises of financial support, questions about Patricia's well-being. Ruth's eyes welled up as she read Howard's internal struggle laid bare on yellowed paper. At the bottom of the stack, a newer envelope caught her eye. The paper was crisp, the ink still dark. It was addressed to Howard but had never been sent. Ruth recognized Patricia's handwriting from the previous documents. Dear Dad, it began. I know we've never had the relationship either of us wanted. But I have two beautiful daughters, your granddaughters. They deserve to know their grandfather. They're so much like you. Selah has your artistic talent and Simone has your spirit. Please consider meeting them." The letter was dated just weeks before Patricia's death. "We found that when we were going through Mom's things," Simone's voice startled Ruth. She turned to find both twins standing at the attic entrance. "She never sent it," Selah added softly, moving to sit beside Ruth on the dusty floor. She was scared he might say no. "Mom always talked about him kindly," Simone said, settling on Ruth's other side. She said he did what he could, even from a distance. She understood why he couldn't be there more. Ruth clutched the letters to her chest, feeling the weight of years of secrets and unspoken words. Howard's struggle between his duty to his new family and his guilt over Patricia was written in every carefully worded response, every mailed check, every tentative inquiry about his daughter's life. Later that evening, Ruth sat in her favorite chair by the fireplace. The letters lay in her lap alongside a small photograph of a young Patricia, a smiling girl with Howard's eyes. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room as Ruth sat in contemplation, feeling both lighter and heavier with her new understanding. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Ruth flipped another pancake onto the growing stack. The sweet aroma of maple syrup filled the air, and she could hear the twins chattering softly at the dining table. Her heart felt lighter than it had in days. "Girls," Ruth said, carrying the plate of pancakes to the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Selah and Simone looked up, their expressions a mixture of hope and anxiety. Ruth noticed how they unconsciously moved closer together, as if bracing for bad news. "I want you both to know that you can stay here," Ruth continued, her voice gentle but firm. "As long as you need to." Simone's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" "We won't be any trouble," Selah added quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed their hands. "I know you won't. Now eat your breakfast before it gets cold." Later that morning, Ruth called Ms. Perry. The social worker's voice was professional, but kind as she explained the guardianship process. Ruth scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad. Court appearances, background checks, home studies, financial documentation. "It won't be easy," Ms. Perry warned. "There's quite a bit of paperwork and the legal fees can add up." Ruth glanced at her checkbook and budget sheets spread across the kitchen counter. The numbers seemed to swim before her eyes. Could she really afford this? Was she too old to take on such responsibility? From the living room came the sound of Simone sweeping the floor, while Selah was carefully dusting the photographs on the mantel. Without being asked, they'd started helping around the house, trying to make things easier for her. "I understand," Ruth told Ms. Perry. "But these girls need a home. Send me whatever forms I need to fill out." Throughout the afternoon, Ruth organized her papers into neat piles: insurance documents, bank statements, Howard's pension information. Her arthritic fingers ached from writing, but she pressed on. "Can we help?" Simone asked, peering over Ruth's shoulder at the stack of papers. "Actually," Ruth said, "you could help me sort these by date." They worked together quietly, the only sound the rustling of papers and the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Ruth noticed how carefully Selah handled each document, how Simone double-checked the dates to make sure everything was in order. As evening approached, Ruth watched the twins set up an old Scrabble board on the coffee table. Their faces were relaxed, their movements less guarded than before. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the scene. For the first time since Howard's passing, the house felt truly alive again. Ruth woke before sunrise, her mind already organizing the day ahead. She sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, carefully writing out a schedule in her neat handwriting. The house needed structure, for the twins and for herself. Around 9, she heard footsteps upstairs. The girls appeared in the doorway, still in their pajamas, looking sleepy but less guarded than previous mornings. "Good morning," Ruth said warmly. "There's cereal in the pantry, or I can make you some eggs." After breakfast, Ruth gathered them in the living room. "We need to talk about how things will work around here," she began, noting how they tensed slightly. "Nothing scary, Just some basic rules to help us all get along. Simone nodded while Selah picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. Everyone helps with chores, Ruth explained. It makes the house run smoother. Today, I'll show you how I like things done. In the laundry room, Ruth demonstrated her folding technique. See how the corners match up? She showed them with a towel. Your mother, was she particular about laundry? Mom just kind of balled everything up, Simone said with a small laugh. But she taught us to separate colors. She said pink socks weren't a fashion statement. Ruth chuckled and the tension eased. They moved to the kitchen where Ruth explained her system for loading the dishwasher. As they worked, stories about Patricia flowed naturally. Ruth found herself hungry for these small details about the daughter-in-law she never knew. That evening, Ruth was reading in her chair when unfamiliar sounds drew her to the kitchen. She found flour dusting the counter, and both girls bent over a cookbook. We wanted to thank you, Simone explained, pulling a tray of slightly misshapen cookies from the oven. Mom's recipe. She always said baking fixes everything, Selah added softly. The kitchen was warm with the smell of vanilla and chocolate. As they sampled the cookies, more stories emerged. Patricia singing while she cooked, her famous burnt pancakes, her ability to make even boxed mac and cheese feel special. Later, Ruth settled into her chair by the fire. From the next room came the sound of the twins' laughter, bright and clear. The house felt different now, fuller, warmer, alive with possibility. For the first time since Howard's passing, the silence had been replaced with something better. And the Sunday morning light filtered through the stained glass windows as Ruth led the twins into the church. She had picked out their best clothes, matching blue dresses she'd found in their backpacks. The familiar wooden pews and hymn books brought her comfort, but she could feel the twins' nervousness in how they walked close beside her. It'll be fine, she whispered, though her own heart was racing. They found seats near the middle, where Ruth had sat every Sunday for 40 years. As they settled in, the whispers started, soft at first, then growing like rustling leaves. Mrs. Peterson, 2 rows ahead, kept turning around to stare. The Johnsons, usually quick to wave hello, suddenly became very interested in their hymnals. Ruth sat straighter, willing herself to focus on Reverend Miller's sermon about acceptance and love. The irony wasn't lost on her. After the final hymn, Ruth guided the twins toward the lobby. She could feel Simone's tension, the way the girls' shoulders were set rigid. Selah stayed half hidden behind her sister, eyes downcast. Ruth, Mrs. Harper's voice carried across the lobby. She approached with a too bright smile. How interesting to see you here with your guests. These are my granddaughters, Ruth said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. Oh? Mrs. Harper's eyebrows shot up. I wasn't aware Howard had other children. Surely you would have mentioned that over our years of friendship. I don't see how that's any of your business, Simone cut in, her voice sharp with hurt. Ruth placed a gentle hand on Simone's shoulder. Mrs. Harper, these girls are my family now. That's all anyone needs to know. Well, Mrs. Harper sniffed, I suppose we'll all have to adjust to these changes in our community. Ruth felt something shift inside her, a strength she didn't know she had. Yes, we will, and I expect Christian charity from my church family. Her voice was quiet but firm. The drive home was silent. Ruth could see the twins in her rearview mirror, Selah wiping at her eyes while Simone stared stonily out the window. Back in the safety of their house, Ruth gathered them close. Don't let them make you feel unwelcome, she said softly. You belong here with me. But as she watched them climb the stairs to change out of their church clothes, Ruth's heart ached. She hadn't expected such coldness from people she'd known for decades. The weight of what lay ahead, the whispers, the stares, the judgment, settled heavily on her shoulders. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the snow glittering like diamonds in the early light. Ruth stood in the kitchen, watching the twins eat their breakfast of toast and eggs. Their shoulders were still tense from yesterday's church experience. I need to run some errands in town, Ruth announced, pulling on her warm coat. Will you two be okay here for a few hours? Selah nodded quietly while Simone gave a thumbs up, her mouth full of toast. Ruth hesitated at the door, then left with a small wave. As soon as Ruth's car disappeared down the snowy driveway, Simone turned to her sister with a determined look. "Let's clean this whole house. Really make it shine." Selah's eyes lit up. Mom always said actions speak louder than words. The twins got to work, tackling one room at a time. Selah meticulously dusted every shelf and picture frame, while Simone attacked the floors with the vacuum cleaner. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally breaking into giggles when one of them found something interesting. "Look at this," Simone called from the pantry. "She has everything organized by type, just like Mom tried to do." She laughed, remembering their mother's failed attempts at being organized. "Remember how she'd always mix up the sugar and salt?" Selah smiled, wiping down a window. "And that time she put cinnamon in the spaghetti sauce instead of oregano?" "Mom was the worst cook," Simone said fondly, straightening cans on the shelf. "But she always made us laugh about it." When Ruth returned home, she stopped in the doorway, stunned. The hardwood floors gleamed, the windows sparkled, and even the old family photos seemed brighter. The twins stood in the living room, looking nervous but proud. "We wanted to thank you," Selah said softly. Ruth set down her bags, deeply touched by their gesture. This is wonderful," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you both." Later, they sat around the kitchen table, steam rising from their cups of tea. Ruth listened as the twins shared stories about Patricia, each memory bringing them closer together. For the first time, the kitchen felt truly warm and alive, filled with the sound of gentle laughter and quiet conversation. The farmer's market bustled with activity under the winter sun. Colorful stalls lined the street, filled with root vegetables, preserved goods, and fresh-baked bread. Ruth watched as Selah and Simone's eyes widened at the displays. "Can we look at the apple butter?" Simone asked, pointing to a nearby stall. Ruth smiled, nodding. "Of course, we need some fresh vegetables too." As they moved between the stalls, collecting items in their basket, Ruth noticed how the twins were slowly relaxing. Selah even reached out to touch a handmade quilt, admiring its intricate pattern. Their peaceful shopping was interrupted by loud laughter. A group of teenagers loitered near the bread stall, and one boy, tall with a Letterman jacket, pointed at the twins. "Hey, looks like someone's cleaning lady brought her kids to work," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Simone froze mid-step, her hand clutching a jar of honey. Selah immediately moved closer to her sister, eyes downcast. Ruth felt heat rise in her chest. Without hesitation, she stepped between the twins and the boy, drawing herself up to her full height. "Young man," she said, her voice clear and steady, "those are my granddaughters you're talking about. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." The boy's smirk faltered. Around them, other shoppers and vendors had stopped to watch. "I also suggest," Ruth continued, her tone firm but controlled, "that you consider how your mother would feel hearing you speak to anyone that way. Where are your manners?" The boy's face reddened. Behind him, Mrs. Thompson, the bread vendor, crossed her arms and gave him a stern look. Other market-goers murmured disapprovingly. "Sorry," he mumbled, quickly turning away. His friends followed, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Ruth turned to the twins. Selah pressed against her side, trembling slightly. Simone stood rigid, trying to appear strong, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. They finished their shopping quickly and walked to the car. As soon as the doors closed, Simone's brave facade crumbled. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Ruth reached back and squeezed her hand. "Listen to me, both of you. Don't let anyone make you feel less than who you are. You're strong, beautiful, and most importantly, your family. My family." Ruth watched the twins pick at their dinner, the earlier market incident weighing heavily on everyone's minds. Steam rose from the pot roast she'd prepared, but no one seemed particularly hungry. "Selah, I noticed you drawing earlier. Do you enjoy art?" Ruth asked, trying to lift the somber mood. Selah nodded shyly. "Mom always said I got it from—" She hesitated, glancing at Ruth. "From Howard." "And what about you, Simone? What do you like to do?" Ruth turned to the other twin, but something was wrong. Simone's face had gone pale, her fork clattering against her plate. "I don't feel—" Simone's words slurred, and before Ruth could react, the girl slumped sideways, falling from her chair. "Simone!" Selah screamed, rushing to her sister's side. Ruth's heart pounded as she grabbed the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "My granddaughter collapsed," she explained to the dispatcher, the word granddaughter coming naturally now. "Please hurry." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens piercing the quiet evening. Ruth held Selah's hand tightly as they followed the ambulance to the hospital. In the sterile white hallway, Dr. Patel, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, explained Simone's condition. "Sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder that can cause severe pain crises," she said gently. "Stress and poor nutrition can trigger episodes." Ruth felt her knees weaken. "I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Selah, who stood crying quietly beside her. "We were scared," Selah whispered. "Mom could barely afford the medications. We thought if you knew, you wouldn't want us anymore." Ruth's heart broke at the admission. She pulled Selah close, stroking her hair. "Oh, sweetheart, nothing could make me send you away. Nothing." Dr. Patel outlined Simone's treatment plan, explaining the medications and dietary requirements. Ruth listened intently, taking mental notes of everything they'd need. Later that night, Ruth sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside Simone's bed. The steady beep of monitors filled the room as Simone slept, looking small and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights. Selah had finally dozed off in another chair, exhausted from crying. Ruth reached out and took Simone's hand, noticing how fragile it felt in hers. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt determined. These girls needed her, and she wouldn't let them down. Ruth helped Simone settle into the guest room, adjusting pillows and making sure everything was within reach. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the pale-faced girl. "Are you comfortable enough, sweetheart?" Ruth asked, smoothing the blanket. Simone nodded weakly. "Yes, thank you." Her voice was tired but grateful. Selah sat cross-legged on the bed next to her sister, organizing the new medications into a daily pill organizer. The quiet concentration on her face reminded Ruth so much of Howard that it made her heart ache. The phone's sharp ring cut through the peaceful moment. Ruth hurried to answer it, keeping her voice low. "Ruth? I just heard about what happened at dinner last night." Mrs. Harper's voice crackled through the receiver. "The whole town's talking about it. Are you sure you can handle this situation? 2 teenagers is one thing, but a sick child?" Ruth's grip tightened on the phone. "I appreciate your concern, Margaret, but we're managing just fine." "Well, at your age, dear, and with your limited experience, perhaps it would be better for everyone if—" "If what, Margaret?" Ruth's voice grew firm. "If I turned my back on my family?" The doorbell interrupted the tense conversation. Through the window, Ruth spotted Mrs. Alvarez, the kind-faced woman who lived next door, holding what looked like a covered casserole dish. "I need to go, Margaret. Someone's at the door." Ruth hung up before Mrs. Harper could respond. Mrs. Alvarez greeted her with a warm smile. "I heard about Simone. My mother had sickle cell, so I know how challenging it can be. I made you all some chicken enchiladas. It's a good, hearty meal." Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes as she accepted the dish. "Thank you, Elena. This means more than you know." Later that evening, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by medical pamphlets and care instructions. The phone had rung several more times, curious neighbors trying to get the latest gossip, but she'd let it go to voicemail. She could hear Selah reading quietly to Simone upstairs, their voices a gentle reminder of why she couldn't give up, no matter what the town thought. The aroma of Mrs. Alvarez's enchiladas filled the kitchen, a reminder that not everyone was against them. Ruth picked up the doctor's instructions again, determined to memorize every detail of Simone's care plan. She might be older, she might be inexperienced, but she would prove them all wrong. These girls were her family now, and family stuck together. Ruth's footsteps creaked softly on the attic stairs as she made her way up with a flashlight in hand. The twins were finally asleep, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. Dust particles danced in the beam of her light as she moved between the stacked boxes and old furniture. "There must be something else," she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the wooden beams. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old dresser, sat a chest she'd never noticed before. It was made of dark wood, with brass fittings that had turned green with age. Ruth's heart quickened as she recognized it as Howard's old military trunk. Back in his study, she found the spare key in his desk drawer, exactly where he'd always kept it. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the lid creaked open. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed papers, lay a leather-bound journal. Ruth settled onto the floor, crossed her legs, and opened it carefully. Howard's familiar handwriting filled the pages, along with detailed sketches of faces. Patricia as a child, the twins as babies. "My dearest Patricia," one entry read, "Today you turned 16, and I wasn't there. Your mother sent a photo. You have my eyes, but thankfully, your mother's smile. The guilt of my absence weighs heavier with each passing year." Ruth's vision blurred with tears as she read entry after entry. Howard had documented everything: his struggle with the secret, his periodic attempts to help Patricia financially, his deep regret at choosing stability over responsibility. At the bottom of the chest, she found an envelope stuffed with cash and a sealed letter. The envelope was marked, "For Patricia and the girls." Inside the letter, Howard's words caught in Ruth's throat. "Patricia, I failed you as a father. I chose the easier path and you paid the price. These funds are for you and your daughters. It's not nearly enough, but I hope it helps. Ruth is a good woman with a generous heart. When I'm gone, if you ever need her, I pray she'll understand and forgive me. All my love, Dad." Ruth clutched the letter to her chest, her emotions swirling between anger at Howard's deception and a deep, aching understanding of his internal struggle. The man she'd loved had carried this burden alone, trying to balance his past mistakes with his present life. She gathered the journal and money, making her way back downstairs to the living room. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange light across the room. Ruth placed the journal on her nightstand and sank into her chair. "I'll do right by them, Howard," she whispered to the quiet room. Ruth's fingers drummed nervously on her kitchen table as she waited for Miss Perry to arrive. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the stack of papers she'd gathered. In the living room, Selah was quietly helping Simone with her medications. The doorbell rang precisely at 9. Ms. Perry stood on the porch, briefcase in hand, her professional demeanor both reassuring and intimidating. "Good morning, Ruth," she said, stepping inside. "I brought all the paperwork we'll need to get started." They settled at the kitchen table where Ms. Perry laid out document after document. "The process won't be easy," she explained, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll need to prove you have the financial means and capability to care for both girls, especially considering Simone's medical needs." Ruth nodded, pushing Howard's journal aside to make room for the growing pile of forms. "I've been organizing my finances. I have my pension, savings, and—" She hesitated before adding, "some money Howard left behind." Ms. Perry's expression grew serious. "There's something else you should know. Patricia's uncle, James Morton, has expressed interest in contesting any guardianship arrangement. He lives in Michigan and hasn't seen the girls in years, but legally he has the right to challenge." Ruth's heart sank. From the living room, she could hear Selah's soft voice reading to Simone. The sound strengthened her resolve. "What do I need to do?" Ruth asked, straightening her shoulders. "First, we'll need character references. Do you have anyone in the community who can vouch for you?" "Yes," Ruth replied, thinking of Mrs. Alvarez's kindness. "I have a few people in mind." They spent the morning going through requirements, home inspections, financial statements, medical arrangements for Simone. With each new challenge, Ruth felt both overwhelmed and more determined. The twins noticed her stress. Throughout the day, they quietly helped around the house, Selah organizing the kitchen while Simone, still recovering but insistent on helping, folded laundry from her spot on the couch. By evening, Ruth's kitchen table had become a command center of sorted papers, filled forms, and to-do lists. She rubbed her tired eyes looking at the organized chaos before her. Her gaze fell on Howard's journal, sitting at the edge of the table. Inside were his written regrets and unspoken wishes. She placed her hand on its worn cover, drawing strength from the connection to her past while facing this new future. Ruth's hand shook slightly as she dialed Mrs. Alvarez's number. After 3 rings, her neighbor's warm voice answered, "Maria, I need your help with something important." Mrs. Alvarez listened intently as Ruth explained her idea for a community meeting. "Of course, mi amiga, my house is perfect for this. We'll show everyone what a wonderful grandmother you are to those girls." Over the next few days, Ruth and Mrs. Alvarez worked together, creating simple flyers and personally inviting selected neighbors. They chose Mrs. Alvarez's spacious living room as the meeting place, hoping its welcoming atmosphere would help ease tensions. When the evening arrived, Ruth's stomach was in knots. She stood before the gathered group, her voice initially trembling. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know there have been questions about my decision to take in Sela and Simone." Ruth shared the story of the snowy night when the twins arrived, Howard's journal, and her growing love for the girls. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about Simone's medical needs and her determination to provide them both with a stable home. Sela, usually so quiet, surprised everyone by speaking next. "Our mom tried so hard to take care of us," she said softly. "Before she died, she told us about our grandfather Howard and how kind he was the few times they met." Simone added, her voice clear and strong despite her recent hospital stay. "Ruth has done more for us in these few weeks than anyone else ever has. She's learning about my sickle cell, making sure I take my medicine, and giving us a real home." The room fell silent. Mrs. Harper sat stiffly in her chair, but others showed signs of softening. Mrs. Alvarez stood up first. "I will write a letter of recommendation. These girls belong with Ruth." Mr. Johnson, the retired schoolteacher, raised his hand. "My wife and I could organize a small fundraiser. Medical bills shouldn't stand in the way of keeping this family together." More voices joined in with offers of support. Ruth felt tears welling up as she watched the twins' faces light up with hope. Not everyone was convinced. She could see that in some of the tight smiles and crossed arms, but enough people stood with her to make a difference. Back home that evening, Ruth watched Sela and Simone from the doorway as they worked on their puzzle. Their heads were bent close together, dark curls mixing as they searched for matching pieces. The sight filled her heart with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Ruth's hands gripped her phone tightly as Ms. Perry delivered the news. "Gerald has filed a formal petition to contest your guardianship, Mrs. Callahan." A cold knot formed in Ruth's stomach. "What exactly is he claiming?" "He's questioning your ability to care for the twins, citing your age and Simone's medical condition as primary concerns." Ms. Perry's voice was gentle but firm. "We need to act quickly." That afternoon, Ruth sat across from Mr. Daniels in his modest office downtown. He was a kind-faced man with graying temples and reading glasses perched on his nose. "Gerald's petition is aggressive," he explained, reviewing the paperwork. "But his arguments are weak. We can fight this." The initial hearing came too quickly. Ruth wore her best navy dress and sat straight-backed in the courtroom, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel. The twins sat behind her with Ms. Perry, their faces tight with worry. Gerald strutted into the courtroom in an expensive suit, barely glancing at the girls. When he spoke, his voice dripped with false concern. "Your Honor, I'm simply worried about the children's welfare. Mrs. Callahan is nearly 70. How can she possibly manage Simone's medical needs?" Ruth felt her face flush with anger. She stood when it was her turn, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Your Honor, I may be older, but I have love, resources, and determination. These girls need stability and care, not someone who's only interested in their inheritance." Gerald's face darkened at the accusation. Judge Walker, a stern woman with kind eyes, listened carefully to both sides before declaring, "I'm granting a continuance. Both parties will have time to gather evidence and witnesses. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." Outside the courthouse, Ruth took the twins to Molly's ice cream parlor. As they sat in a quiet booth, Simone picked at her sundae. "Are you sure you want to fight for us, Ruth? It seems like so much trouble." Ruth reached across the table and squeezed their hands. "Listen to me, both of you. You're not trouble. You're family. And I promise you, I'm not letting you go." The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade stark against the morning sky. Ruth smoothed her navy dress with trembling hands, then turned to check on the twins. Selah and Simone sat quietly in their matching white blouses and dark skirts, their usual energy subdued by the weight of the moment. "You both look beautiful," Ruth said softly, reaching back to squeeze their hands. Inside the courtroom, Ruth clutched the stack of support letters in her lap. Mrs. Alvarez's neat handwriting topped the pile, followed by testimonials from other neighbors who had witnessed Ruth's dedication to the twins over the past weeks. The room felt too warm, too crowded with tension. When Ruth took the stand, she forced herself to look directly at Judge Walker. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke from her heart. "These girls aren't just Howard's grandchildren to me anymore," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "They're my family. When Simone was in the hospital, I stayed up all night watching her breathe. When Selah has nightmares about losing her mother, I hold her until she falls back asleep." Ruth pulled Howard's journal from her bag. "My husband may have kept secrets, but in his final writings he expressed his deepest wish, that these girls would know love and stability. I aim to honor that wish." Gerald's attorney was quick to counter. "Mrs. Callahan is 68 years old. She lives on a fixed income. One of the minors has a serious medical condition requiring extensive care. How can she possibly provide adequate support?" Gerald himself spoke with cold precision. "Blood ties matter. I'm their closest living relative. Mrs. Callahan is merely their grandfather's widow. A stranger, really." The twins' testimony came next. Selah spoke so quietly the judge had to lean forward to hear her. "When Mom died, we thought we'd never feel safe again," she said. "But Ruth, she makes us feel like we belong somewhere." Simone's voice rang clearer. "She learned all about my sickle cell. She makes sure I take my medicine and eat right. She fights for us, not because she has to, but because she wants to." Mr. Daniels presented bank statements showing Gerald's complete absence from the twins' lives until Patricia's insurance policy came into play. "My client offers love," he argued. "Mr. Patterson offers only self-interest." The judge studied her notes carefully before looking up. While Mrs. Callahan's age and resources present challenges, her demonstrated commitment to these children is remarkable. The court finds that the best interests of Selah and Simone will be served by granting permanent guardianship to Ruth Callahan. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled Ruth's cozy living room as she carefully unwrapped old Christmas ornaments. Tissue paper crinkled beneath her fingers while she watched Selah and Simone hang sparkling baubles on the tree's branches. The girls' eyes lit up with each new decoration they discovered. "Look at this one." Simone held up a handmade ornament, a faded construction paper angel with glitter falling from its wings. "Did you make this, Ruth?" Ruth chuckled. "Howard made that one, actually. He wasn't much of an artist, but he loved Christmas crafts." Selah, quieter as always, sat cross-legged by the box of decorations. She pulled out a string of vintage glass beads, handling them with delicate care. "These are beautiful," she whispered. The kitchen timer chimed, and Ruth hurried to check on the latest batch of sugar cookies. The twins had insisted on using Patricia's recipe, which they remembered by heart. The familiar smell brought tears to their eyes earlier, but now it just made them smile. Mrs. Alvarez knocked on the door carrying a plate of tamales wrapped in festive paper. "My mother's recipe," she explained, setting them on the counter. "Every child should have special holiday food." Throughout the afternoon, more neighbors stopped by. Mrs. Johnson brought a hand-knitted scarf for each of the girls. Even Mrs. Harper, who had been so judgmental at first, dropped off a Christmas card with a hesitant but genuine smile. Later, the twins disappeared upstairs, giggling and whispering. When they came back down, they carried a large, flat package wrapped in newspaper. "We made this for you," Selah said softly, while Simone nodded encouragingly. Ruth carefully unwrapped it to find a collage of photos. In the center was a picture of Howard from his younger days, smiling broadly. Around it were photos of Patricia that the twins had saved, and newer snapshots of themselves with Ruth. Small drawings and decorations filled the spaces between, creating a beautiful family tree. "We wanted to show how we're all connected," Simone explained, her voice catching slightly. "Even if it's not how we expected." Ruth pulled both girls into a tight hug, feeling their warmth against her. The Christmas tree lights twinkled behind them, casting a soft glow over their faces. Outside, snow began to fall, but inside, their home was filled with warmth and the promise of many more holidays together. The morning sun filtered through frost-covered windows as Ruth and the twins worked to restore order to their living room. Wrapping paper and ribbons from yesterday's Christmas celebration still littered the floor, and empty boxes needed sorting. "I'll take these empty boxes back to the attic," Ruth said, gathering an armful. "We'll help," Simone offered, following Ruth up the narrow stairs with Selah close behind. In the dusty attic light, Ruth noticed something she'd missed during their previous searches: a weathered leather journal wedged behind some boxes. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Howard's handwriting on the cover. "What's that?" Selah asked softly, noticing Ruth's fixed gaze. Ruth's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The first page revealed a detailed pencil sketch of a young girl with familiar features, Patricia. The drawing captured a playful smile that reminded Ruth of Simone. "Girls, come here," Ruth called, her voice thick with emotion. "I think you should see this." They gathered around as Ruth turned the pages. Howard's artistic talent shone through in every sketch. Imagined scenes of grandchildren playing in the garden, detailed portraits of Patricia at different ages, even rough sketches of what appeared to be Selah and Simone, though he'd never met them. Between the drawings were Howard's private thoughts, written in his neat handwriting. "I dream of the day I might meet my grandchildren. Will they have Patricia's smile? Will they love art like she did? The weight of my absence grows heavier each year." Simone wiped tears from her eyes as Ruth read aloud. "He wanted to know us," she whispered. "Mom used to say she wished we could have met him," Selah added, tracing her finger over one of the sketches. She'd love to see these drawings. Ruth turned another page, revealing Howard's last entry. "My greatest regret is not being there for Patricia. I pray someday my grandchildren will know how much I wanted to be part of their lives. Ruth would have loved them so much." "He was right about that," Simone said, squeezing Ruth's hand. "Can we keep this somewhere special?" Selah asked. "Like a family treasure?" Ruth nodded, holding the journal close. "We'll keep it with our most precious things." They settled on the living room couch together, the journal open across their laps. As they flipped through more pages, Ruth felt a warmth spread through her chest. Howard's words and drawings had built an unexpected bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what was found. Ruth sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as morning light streamed through the windows. She'd chosen the softest yarn she could find, a deep purple for Selah and forest green for Simone. Her fingers moved steadily, weaving love into every stitch. "Just like Mom taught me," she whispered to herself, remembering childhood lessons at her mother's knee. The thought warmed her as she worked, knowing she was passing on a piece of family tradition to the twins. When she finished the last stitch, she carefully folded the scarves and placed them in tissue paper. Her heart fluttered with anticipation as she called out, "Girls, could you come down for a minute?" The twins appeared in the doorway, curious expressions on their faces. Simone's eyes darted to the wrapped packages while Selah hung back slightly, still shy despite their growing closeness. "I made these for you," Ruth said, holding out the packages. "I wanted you to have something special, something that shows how much you mean to me." The girls carefully unwrapped their gifts. Selah ran her fingers over the intricate pattern, while Simone immediately wrapped hers around her neck. "It's so soft," Selah whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "We have something for you too," Simone announced, disappearing briefly before returning with a carefully wrapped package. Ruth opened it to find a handmade wooden frame, decorated with painted flowers and seashells. Inside was a photo Mrs. Alvarez had taken of them during Christmas dinner, all three smiling, their faces glowing with happiness. "We worked on it in secret," Selah explained softly, "every time you were busy in the kitchen." Ruth pulled both girls into a tight hug, feeling their warmth against her. "This is perfect," she managed through happy tears. Standing up, Ruth walked to the mantel and placed the frame in the center, adjusting it until it was just right. "There," she declared. "Right where it belongs, in the heart of our home." The twins beamed at her, their new scarves wrapped snugly around their necks despite the warmth of the house. In that moment, Ruth felt the last pieces of their family clicking into place, as natural as the morning sun streaming through the windows. The January morning dawned crisp and clear as Ruth stirred oatmeal on the stove. The sweet smell of cinnamon and brown sugar filled the kitchen. She hummed softly, already planning their day ahead. The library cards she'd gotten for the twins last week were sitting on the counter, ready for their first use. "Something smells amazing," Simone said, padding into the kitchen in her fuzzy socks. Selah followed close behind, her hair still messy from sleep. "I thought we'd start the new year with a proper breakfast," Ruth said, ladling the steaming oatmeal into bowls. "We've got a busy day ahead." At the library, Ruth watched with pride as the twins explored the shelves. Simone's eyes lit up at the art section, her fingers trailing along spines of books about painting techniques and famous artists. Meanwhile, Selah disappeared into the poetry corner, emerging with an armful of classics and historical novels. "Look at this one," Simone whispered excitedly, showing Ruth a book about watercolor painting. "It shows you how to blend colors just like Mom used to do." After checking out their books, they headed to the park. Fresh snow blanketed the ground, pristine and inviting. The twins couldn't resist. Soon they were running through it, leaving trails of footprints and throwing snowballs at each other. Their laughter echoed across the empty playground. "They seem happy," a voice said beside Ruth. She turned to find Mr. Jensen, their neighbor from 3 houses down, smiling at the scene. "They're adjusting well," Ruth replied, watching as Selah attempted to make a snow angel. "Listen," Mr. Jensen said, shifting his weight. "I know things haven't been easy with some folks in town, but what you're doing, it takes real courage. If you ever need help with anything, fixing that loose gutter or shoveling the drive, just let me know." Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, James. That means a lot." That evening, gathered in the living room, the twins could hardly contain their excitement about their library finds. Simone spread her art books across the coffee table, while Selah read aloud from a book of Emily Dickinson poems. Ruth settled into her chair by the fire, watching them share their discoveries. The sound of their animated voices drifted from the next room as they continued exploring their books. A warm feeling of contentment settled over her as she listened to their chatter, grateful for how far they'd come together. Ruth's hands trembled as she held the yellowed envelope. Howard's familiar handwriting stared back at her, the date stamp marking a time years before his death. She'd found it tucked away in a folder while sorting through Simone's medical paperwork. "Do I even want to know?" she whispered to herself, running her finger along the sealed edge. After several minutes of internal debate, she carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Howard's distinctive penmanship filled the page. "My dearest Ruth, by the time you read this, you may already know about Patricia. The weight of this secret has been crushing me for years. I've started and destroyed this letter 100 times, but I owe you the truth. I was young and foolish when I met Patricia's mother. When I learned about Patricia, I was already in love with you. Fear kept me silent. Fear of losing you. Fear of destroying our happiness. I've sent money and kept minimal contact over the years, but I know that doesn't excuse my silence. You are the love of my life, Ruth. The family we built together means everything to me. But my cowardice in not telling you about Patricia will always be my greatest regret. With all my love, Howard." Ruth's vision blurred with tears. The letter dropped to her lap as emotions crashed over her. Anger at his deception, sadness for the burden he'd carried, and a deep, aching understanding of his struggle. "Grandma Ruth?" Simone's voice came from the doorway. "Are you okay?" Ruth looked up to find both twins watching her with concern. She wiped her eyes and held out the letter. "I found something from your grandfather." They read it together on the couch, Selah and Simone pressed close on either side of Ruth. When they finished, Simone squeezed Ruth's hand. You know what we should do? Simone said softly. We should plant something in the garden. For both of them, Grandpa Howard and Mom. That's a beautiful idea, Ruth replied, touched by the suggestion. They spent the evening planning their memorial garden, Selah sketching layouts while Simone researched plants. Ruth watched them work, her heart full of bittersweet peace. Later that night, Ruth carefully placed Howard's letter in his journal. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps it could help grow something new. Ruth's heart sank as she watched Selah pick at her breakfast. The usually quiet girl seemed even more withdrawn, her dark eyes lacking their usual sparkle. When Selah's fork clattered against her plate for the third time, Ruth couldn't ignore her worry any longer. "Sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" Ruth asked, placing a gentle hand on Selah's forehead. "Just tired," Selah mumbled, but her pale complexion told a different story. "You're staying home to rest," Ruth said firmly. "I'm calling Dr. Patel." Simone hovered nearby, concern etched on her face. "I'll help clean up, Ruth. You take care of Selah." At the doctor's office that afternoon, Dr. Patel examined Selah thoroughly, while Ruth twisted her hands in her lap. The diagnosis brought both relief and worry, exhaustion and mild anemia. "It's not uncommon after prolonged stress," Dr. Patel explained, writing out some dietary recommendations. "Her body needs time to recover from everything she's been through. Good nutrition and rest will make a world of difference." Back home, Ruth immediately began implementing changes. She reorganized their daily schedule, marking specific times for rest and relaxation. Simone surprised her by taking initiative, helping to prepare iron-rich meals and keeping the house tidy. "I can handle the dishes," Simone insisted that evening, shooing Ruth away from the sink. "You taught me how to do them right. Go sit with Selah. She's trying to sketch but keeps nodding off." Ruth found Selah curled up in the window seat, her sketchbook sliding from her lap. The sight reminded her how young and vulnerable the twins really were, despite their strength. She carefully tucked a blanket around Selah's shoulders, her heart full of protective love. "You don't have to push yourself so hard anymore," Ruth whispered, smoothing Selah's hair. "We're going to take care of you properly now." That night, as Ruth tucked Selah into bed, she saw the ghost of a smile on the girl's tired face. "Thank you," Selah murmured sleepily. "You're safe now," Ruth whispered, continuing to stroke Selah's hair until her breathing evened out in sleep. Ruth woke early on New Year's Eve, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as she started her preparations, making lists and checking recipes. "Girls," she called up the stairs, "time to get ready for our guests." Selah and Simone bounded down, already dressed and eager to help. The kitchen soon filled with warmth and delicious smells as they worked together. Simone, wearing an apron that was slightly too big, carefully measured ingredients for her chocolate cake. "Is this enough vanilla, Ruth?" she asked, holding up the measuring spoon. Ruth smiled, noting how Simone's confidence had grown. "Perfect, sweetheart. That cake will be wonderful." At the dining room table, Selah sat surrounded by colored pencils, meticulously drawing each place card. Her artistic talent showed in the delicate flowers and swirling patterns she created. By evening, the house glowed with soft lamplight and festive decorations. Mrs. Alvarez arrived first, carrying a steaming dish of enchiladas. Mr. Jensen followed shortly after with fresh bread from the local bakery. "Ruth," Mrs. Alvarez said, hugging her tightly, "the house looks beautiful." During dinner, conversation flowed easily around the table. Simone proudly served her cake, beaming at the compliments. Selah talked quietly about her plans to join the school's art club, while Mr. Jensen offered to build her an easel for painting. Mrs. Alvarez stood, raising her glass. "To Ruth," she said warmly, "who showed us all what it means to open your heart and home. You've inspired this entire community." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes as everyone clinked glasses. Looking at the faces around her table, the twins' bright smiles, Mrs. Alvarez's warm expression, Mr. Jensen's kind eyes, she felt truly at home. At midnight, they gathered on the porch. The winter air was crisp but not too cold. Fireworks burst overhead in brilliant displays of red, gold, and blue. The twins gasped and pointed at each explosion, their faces lit up with wonder. Ruth woke before dawn, her stomach fluttering with nervous energy. She moved quietly through the house, preparing breakfast and laying out supplies for the twins' first day at their new school. The smell of pancakes and bacon soon filled the kitchen. "Girls, time to get ready," she called softly up the stairs. Selah emerged first, already dressed but pale with anxiety. She picked at her breakfast, barely eating. Simone bounded down a few minutes later, projecting confidence, though Ruth noticed how she kept adjusting and readjusting her backpack straps. "You both look wonderful," Ruth said, smoothing Selah's collar. "Remember, you can call me any time if you need to." The drive to school was quiet. Ruth glanced in the rearview mirror, noting how Selah stared out the window while Simone's leg bounced restlessly. She pulled up to the school entrance, her heart aching at their obvious nervousness. "You are both so strong," she said, turning to face them. "Whatever happens today, we'll face it together. I'm just a phone call away." The day proved challenging for both girls. Selah felt lost in the crowded hallways, shrinking against walls and struggling to find her voice when teachers called on her. At lunch, she sat alone, watching other students laugh and chat while she picked at her sandwich. Simone had a different experience. Her art teacher, Ms. Thompson, praised her sketches during class, making her beam with pride. But later, a group of students cornered her in the hallway, making snide remarks about where she came from and why she was living with Ruth. When Ruth picked them up, the contrast between morning and afternoon was clear on their faces. Selah climbed into the back seat without a word, while Simone's earlier confidence had cracked. "Tell me about your day," Ruth said gently as they drove home. "The good parts and the hard parts." As the twins shared their experiences, Ruth listened carefully, her heart breaking at their struggles, but swelling with pride at their resilience. She immediately called the school and scheduled a meeting with Mr. Carter, the principal, determined to ensure the twins would have the support they needed. That evening, Ruth helped Selah with her math homework while admiring Simone's artwork from art class. "You know," she said, "the first day is always the hardest. It gets easier, I promise." The morning of the final custody hearing dawned cold and clear. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her navy blue blazer, the one she'd worn to Howard's funeral. In the kitchen, she found Selah and Simone already dressed in their Sunday best, quietly sipping hot chocolate. "Whatever happens today," Ruth said, smoothing Selah's collar, "know that I love you both with all my heart." The courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps slick with morning frost. Inside, Ruth clutched Howard's journal tightly to her chest as they made their way to the courtroom. Gerald sat at the opposite table, his expression cold and calculating. When Ruth took the stand, she spoke from her heart. "These girls aren't just Howard's granddaughters," she said, her voice growing stronger. "They're my family now. Every morning when I wake up, I thank God for bringing them into my life." She held up Howard's journal. "My husband may have made mistakes, but he wanted these girls to know love and stability. I'm here to fulfill that wish." Gerald's lawyer tried to paint Ruth as too old and financially unstable to care for teenagers. But Ruth remained composed, describing her careful budgeting and the support network she'd built. When Selah testified, her quiet voice carried through the courtroom. "Before we came to Ruth's house, we were so scared," she said, "but now we have a real home." Simone followed, her chin held high. "Ruth doesn't just take care of us, she loves us. She comes to my doctor's appointments and helps Selah with her art. She's the grandmother we always wanted." Mrs. Alvarez and Mr. Jensen testified about Ruth's dedication, describing how she'd transformed from a lonely widow into a fierce protector of her newfound family. Gerald's testimony was brief and cold, focused entirely on financial matters. He couldn't name the twins' favorite foods or hobbies when questioned. Judge Walker listened carefully to all sides. When he delivered his verdict, granting Ruth permanent guardianship, the courtroom erupted in quiet cheers. Outside, Ruth pulled both girls into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "We're really staying with you, Grandma," Simone whispered. "Forever," Ruth replied, her heart overflowing with joy. The morning air bit with winter's chill as Ruth helped the twins bundle up in their warmest coats. She watched them carefully wrap the bouquet of white lilies they'd chosen together at the flower shop. Sela held the small silver frame containing Patricia's photograph, her fingers tracing the edge with gentle care. "Are you both ready?" Ruth asked softly, noting the quiet determination in their eyes. The drive to the cemetery was hushed, broken only by Simone's occasional whispered directions. Ruth's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart heavy with the weight of this moment. She'd promised the twins they would visit their mother's grave once things settled down after the court hearing. When they arrived, the cemetery stretched before them, a peaceful blanket of white snow covering the grounds. Ruth helped the twins from the car, taking each of their hands in hers. Their footsteps crunched in the fresh snow as they made their way down the path. At Patricia's headstone, Sela's composure crumbled first. Her shoulders shook as quiet sobs escaped her lips. "I miss you so much, Mom," she whispered, clutching the framed photo to her chest. Simone wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. "Remember how she used to sing 'You Are My Sunshine' every morning while making breakfast?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. Even when the toast was burned. Ruth knelt beside the grave, her knees pressing into the cold ground. "Patricia," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry I never got to meet you. I wish things had been different." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I promise you, your girls are safe now. They're loved. They're home." The twins placed the lilies carefully against the headstone. Sela set the framed photo beside them, adjusting it until it sat perfectly straight. "Mom loved having her picture taken," she explained to Ruth. "She said photos helped keep memories alive." "She was right," Ruth replied, squeezing Sela's hand. Simone stepped forward, touching the cold stone. "We're doing okay, Mom," she said firmly. "Grandma Ruth takes really good care of us. She even makes sure I take all my medicine on time, just like you did." Ruth watched as the twins shared more memories. Patricia's terrible attempts at baking cookies, her infectious laugh, the way she would dance around the kitchen while doing dishes. Each story painted a clearer picture of the woman who had raised these remarkable girls. Standing there together, the three of them formed a bridge across time, connecting Patricia's love with Ruth's promise to carry it forward. The winter wind whispered through the trees, but Ruth felt a warmth in her heart that no cold could touch. Finally, Sela stepped back, wiping her eyes. "I think Mom would be happy," she said quietly. "About us being with you, Grandma Ruth." "I think so too, sweetheart," Ruth replied, drawing both girls close. "I think so too." Hand in hand, they made their way back along the snowy path, leaving behind the flowers and photo as testament to a mother's love and a family's unbreakable bond. The spring sun warmed Ruth's back as she led the twins into the backyard, carrying gardening tools and seed packets. The soil, newly thawed from winter's grip, promised fresh beginnings. "Your grandfather Howard loved this garden," Ruth said, kneeling to touch the earth. "He'd spend hours out here, talking to his plants and planning where everything should go." Sela clutched a packet of marigold seeds, her eyes bright with interest. "Did he grow flowers too, Grandma Ruth?" "Oh yes," Ruth smiled, demonstrating how to break up the soil with a small trowel. "He especially loved roses, said they reminded him of life's beauty, even with their thorns." Simone rolled up her sleeves, already digging enthusiastically into the dirt. "Mom used to keep a window box with petunias," she shared. They were bright purple, her favorite color. Ruth showed them how to measure the proper spacing between plants, explaining about sunlight and water needs. Sela worked methodically, creating neat rows for her flowers, marigolds, zinnias, and cosmos in vibrant yellows and pinks. "These colors," Sela said softly, "they're just like the ones Mom used to wear." Meanwhile, Simone mapped out her vegetable plot, marking spaces for tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce. "Just think, we'll have the freshest salads ever," she declared, making Ruth chuckle. As they worked, conversation flowed naturally between them. Sela shared her dream of attending art school someday, describing the painting she wanted to create. Simone's eyes lit up when she talked about her science class and her growing interest in biology. Ruth sat back on her heels, watching the twins work. Pride swelled in her chest as she observed their confidence, so different from the scared girls who had appeared on her doorstep months ago. Simone noticed her watching and grinned, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Look, Grandma Ruth," she called out, gesturing to their progress. "The garden's already coming alive." Ruth surveyed their work. Selah's carefully plotted flower beds, Simone's ambitious vegetable garden, and the small herb patch they'd planted together. Each section represented a piece of their family story: Howard's legacy, Patricia's memory, and their shared future. The three stood together, admiring their handiwork as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across their newly planted garden. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner of Ruth's living room, its lights casting a warm glow across the freshly baked cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. Selah carefully hung delicate glass ornaments while Simone adjusted the tinsel, both girls humming along to Silent Night, playing softly in the background. "Grandma Ruth," Selah called out, her voice trembling with excitement. "Could you close your eyes for a minute? We have something special to show you." Ruth settled into her favorite armchair, her heart full as she closed her eyes. She heard the twins' footsteps hurrying up the stairs, followed by muffled whispers and giggles. "Okay, you can look now," Simone announced. Ruth opened her eyes to find the twins holding a large canvas between them. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the painting, a beautiful family portrait rendered in soft watercolors. There was Howard, his kind eyes twinkling, standing beside a woman Ruth recognized from photographs as Patricia. In the center stood Ruth herself, with Selah and Simone on either side of her, all of them smiling warmly. "We worked on it for weeks," Selah explained softly. "We wanted to show how we're all connected now." Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks as she studied every detail. "It's perfect," she whispered, pulling both girls into a tight hug. After hanging the painting above the fireplace, Ruth retrieved 2 wrapped packages from under the tree. "I have something for you, too." The twins opened their gifts to find matching leather-bound journals, their names embossed in gold on the covers. "For your thoughts, your dreams, your memories," Ruth explained. "Whatever you want to share or keep just for yourselves." They settled onto the couch together, wrapped in soft blankets as the fire crackled. Through the window, they watched snowflakes begin to fall, dusting the world outside in pristine white. "I never knew my life could feel this full again," Ruth admitted, her voice soft with emotion. "You girls are the greatest gift I could have ever received." Simone leaned against Ruth's shoulder. "And you gave us a real home, Grandma Ruth. Someone who really wants us." "We're a family now," Selah added, clutching her new journal to her chest. Ruth pulled them closer as their laughter filled the room, warming every corner of their home. "This is how it was always meant to be," she whispered, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. If you enjoyed the story of Ruth, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.